All right, well, it's 11 o'clock, so let's go ahead and get started here. Welcome to everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name's Jim Holmes. I am the Telerik Test Studio Evangelist, and today you are joining us for kind of an introduction to Telerik's load testing solution. So I am going to be demonstrating and walking through our load testing solution and tooling, which was released in our last release just a month or so ago, and that's Test Studio 2012 R1. So it's the first release of our 2012 year. So my contact information is up there on the screen. By all means, please feel free to reach out to me via email if you've got a question that pops up after the webinar. You can follow me on Twitter there if you'd like, and then also my blog for Telerik Test Studio is there. So that's bit.ly Jim@Test Studio, and that is case sensitive. And I'll be posting that up again as we move through. So today's webinar is really going to run around sort of the practical questions that we're trying to answer for stakeholders as we build systems. We will walk through a couple demos. We will kind of discuss what load testing is about, how it's implemented in Test Studio, and we'll be diving into some good depth on how you get rolling with testing load in Test Studio. So let me flip over to my system here where we have our site, and I'm going to be using this demo site here throughout the webinar today, and this site is really based on an e-commerce site. And unfortunately I forgot to warm this up before I got started here, so it's going to take a minute to get the page up. This is actually a Sitefinity content management system site. Sitefinity is another Telerik product, and I'm using the Sitefinity SDK software development kit, which has a great example in there of an e-commerce site. So when the site gets loaded back up, we can see that this is really kind of a common metaphor for people. Everyone should be familiar with having a site where I can browse around to different products. I can take a look at news feeds, for example. I can also add things to a shopping cart. And imagine, if you will, this company that's running this site is preparing to launch a new product. So the CEO has a couple very burning questions that he wants to know about. And those questions are generally totally not technical. The CEO or your end users or the customers merely want to know, is the site going to crater under traffic when we launch this new product? What's the user's experience going to be as they are looking around and trying to find information about our product while other people are on our site? So there's absolutely nothing technical about this language. These are the business level concerns that those stakeholders, those owners, the people who have their business potentially on the line, these are the plain English questions that they're asking, and they're looking for plain English answers. You may have seen some recent news of sites that didn't do so well recently. A very interesting one is the National Archives released census data from the 1940 census. Now, my wife happens to be a genealogy nut, and this really struck home for me. It turned out there were so many folks interested in that data that the site cratered, completely fell apart, because they hadn't scaled things up correctly to be able to support the release of that new chunk of information. So in this case, it was a government agency releasing some very interesting data, but the same metaphor would go for a retail site as well. And it's not just about whether or not your site craters and falls over. It's also the cost of degraded performance. So there's a really good study from the Aberdeen Group. Now, this is back in 2008, but the idea is still there. And it really ties back to the idea that we are impatient humans, and if a site is slow and not responsive, we'll leave and we'll go do something else. And the Aberdeen Group study actually tied back to past a certain time, each additional second of delay would lose you 10 to 11% of your visitors. So they'd be willing to wait around for, say, 5 seconds for a page to load. But at the 6-second point, you're losing 10% of your people. And at the 7-second point, you're losing another 10% of your people. And this translates directly to lost dollars if you're doing online business, or the whole idea that, regardless of whether or not you're doing online business, you're losing your users and you're failing your mission at being able to keep them engaged with whatever information or services you're provided. All right, so let's go ahead and take a look at how Test Studio can kind of help you out with this. So I'm going to flip back over here, and I have a load test that I've built up, and we'll work on some more details here. But with Test Studio, I can very quickly, I'm going to change this to 3 minutes and just make this a very short run here. I can very quickly stand up a number of items that I want to run, and I can then go and launch this test off. And once I launch that off, I will be able to come over and have a look at different metrics that are popping up here, such as the current virtual users, total created virtual users, and then very important metrics like what's my response time looking like at different levels. What is my, let's say, time to first byte? How long does it take that page to start rendering? And with this kind of information, I can very quickly see that I'm starting to see some performance degradation at key points here, so that response time is really slowing down as we peak out at around 500 users. Alright, so I'm going to stop this test here, and this is kind of the quick overview. Now let's dive into what's behind getting this information out. So while this is stopping, I'm going to bounce back to my slides and we'll discuss some things in a little more detail. So here's what I'm going to be talking about today. I'll talk about the types of load testing because a lot of times there can be some misunderstandings about the differences between different variants of load testing and performance testing. We'll also be talking about setting expectations, and then the what, where, and how. I probably will skip over and leave that for last, and instead we'll dive straight into a demo, and we'll be working on things about how we go about building up good load testing scenarios, how we can capture different use cases or different user profiles that we want to deal with, and how Test Studio can help you gather different pieces of information. So there are a number of different types of load tests, and as I mentioned, a lot of times the terms get confused and misused, or just misunderstood, or two people have a different idea of what a term means. If you hit my Telerik blog for Test Studio, about 6 months ago, I wrote a series of articles around load testing that you may find helpful, and it kind of lays out the terms as we use them for Telerik and Test Studio. But let's start off with soak testing. So soak testing is the idea that I want to know how my system behaves over a long period of time. And with this in mind, I will construct a scenario that's a number of different use cases or user stories, user paths, and I will ramp up to a certain level of load, say 500 concurrent users, and I'll run all of these scenarios for an extremely long, well, what may seem like an extremely long period of time. Soak testing is the idea that I want to know how my system behaves after 2 or 3 days of high traffic use. So I'm not looking for a failover point, but rather what I'm trying to identify is over a long period of time, you get some really interesting information on do we have memory leaks? Are we seeing performance degradation after a day when nothing really of the scenario mix has changed? So this is the idea of trying to help you get back to find out maybe you have some resource problems over time where you might not be releasing resources properly in your system. Maybe you aren't handling your garbage collection correctly, or database locks and whatnot, so that these things cumulatively over time build up, and you might not notice them in an hour-long test, but over 2 or 3 days, all of a sudden these things really stack up and become apparent. So soak testing is the idea of getting up to a relatively high level of usage and seeing how your system behaves over time. The next thing that I want to talk about is failover or tip testing. And the idea here is that we build up scenarios, we build up a number of different use cases, user profiles, and we just start ramping up, and our goal is to see how many current concurrent users or total users we can throw at the system, and we want to find out where the system fails over, to where it becomes unresponsive, to where it starts throwing errors at us. And this gives us an idea of, okay, here is the absolute maximum that with our current system and our current architecture and our current server layout, this is the absolute most that we can ever support. And this lets us make decisions about, do we need to scale out? Do we need to start re-architecting? It gives us an idea of how much traffic we can support. So for example, this can tie back to that CEO's question of, will our site survive the new product launch? And then there's just overall load testing. And this is the idea of starting to push a lot of users at your site and not looking for the failover point, but starting to understand what users' experiences are like when the system is under load. So let's say we determined that our failover point was 5,000 users. If we back that down and we say, okay, we know it's going to fail at 5,000, we think that our regular rate might be like 2,500. So we might ramp up the load to 2,500, and then we start exploring metrics when the system's at that load. What does response time look like? What do our errors look like? Are we getting errors from the virtual users during their scenarios? And then also, during this time, we actually want to be investigating the system manually as well. It's one thing to get all of these metrics back within Test Studio. We get some great reports and some great information back to you, but it's also really critical that you take a look at how the system's behaving with your own eyes while the system is under load, because you'll find things that frankly we can't report back. You may notice things like third-party feeds that aren't behaving properly, or different types of dynamic content or whatever. But it's invaluable, I'd say critical, to do those manual exploratory things while the system's under load, because that, coupled with the information that we'll give you within Test Studio, is really invaluable. So I think there's some important things to set early on in your load testing effort. Load testing is a horse of a different color in that you need to have even more conversations than other types of testing, I think. Load testing requires people. It requires hardware. You're going to want to have something that mimics your actual production environment, or at least fairly close to it, and you're going to need time. You need to get things done early. You need to be monitoring your load and performance goals throughout the life cycle of the entire project. And you have to set realistic goals. I have a very good pal who I've known for a number of years, and he once made what I think is a really pithy but very pointed comment that's very apropos. Do you really need to scale to support China when we're only looking at serving the 4 blocks in our neighborhood? So you need to ensure through a lot of upfront conversation that your marketing people and your stakeholders and everybody who's driving your performance goals, is that load actually realistic? And they're the ones who get to make those determinations, but have the conversations with them. Is this realistic? Because that impacts so many things. And then it's also good to know what's on the table for fixing. If you find out that your site tips over at a certain point, what level of effort are you going to invest to get that fixed and mitigated? And I think having these conversations early on, just like with all of the other software development conversations, have them early, and it just makes for a much better experience and a much more focused and much more valuable experience as you're doing the effort. So that's kind of some of the background, the types of load tests, a little bit about the kind of human side before you even get involved with setting things up. And now what I want to do is start talking into a little more detail about how Test Studio actually will help you with your load testing scenarios and get around to our architecture. So the slide up here really lays out the different components that we have involved in Test Studio for load testing in Test Studio. So there's Test Studio itself, and this is where you're going to create your load test scenarios. I'll show you exactly how we do that. This is also kind of the management console, if you will. You will design, run, and analyze your load tests all from Test Studio. The next component is the controller and reporter combination. So this is a database server, and it's a service that's running on a system. It can be on the same system as Test Studio, or it can be somewhere else. The controller, when you start a load test pass in Test Studio, the controller is responsible for understanding, okay, we've got these 10 different user profiles, we've got this mix of balances for the user profiles or scenarios, and I need to farm all of these out to the different agents that we have configured. So the controller is much like the marshaller. It controls how the load execution is going to be distributed out to the agents that you have built up. And then the other half of that is the reporter. And the reporter is responsible for catching all of the information coming back from the agents. So this is all of the timing, the error conditions, any other data that's coming back about the particular test step and test case that's run. And the reporter simply, during execution, all it does is it's a catcher. It grabs all of that information and gets it into the database and gets it done very quickly. Then once the test is complete, then the reporter serves as your analysis engine. So you'll connect from Test Studio over to the reporter and be able to look at the metrics that are coming through. And actually, I said after the test is complete. That was a misstatement. You also connect to the reporter during the test where you can see real-time metrics coming back across. So now let's talk about, excuse me, let me get a quick drink here. Sorry about that, bit of a dry throat. All right, so the agents are actually responsible for generating the load. These are the things that are going to stand up a virtual user which has a use case and execute all of the information going back and forth about that specific scenario or use case. So the agents work in a very optimized multi-threaded capacity, and the agents are doing the individual HTTP or HTTPS protocol requests and responses. So they'll send a request out to the server, and they'll handle the response that comes back. They'll deal with that and then send a quick bit of information back to the reporter. So the agents are highly multi-threaded, and the agents make really great use of the individual cores on a multi-core system. We've worked really hard to have these extremely optimized. We've got a white paper that our load testing lead has written up that I'm hoping to get published on this. But the net effect here is that rather than having to stand up a huge network of agents, because of the work we've done about optimizing these, per core you can generally have up to 500 virtual users per core. So if you've got a quad-core system, which is kind of typical these days for a beefier dev machine or a server running somewhere, then you can get up to 2,000 virtual users on that single machine. And this means that it's really easy for you to build up extremely large load test scenarios, tens of thousands of virtual users, without having to break the bank and buy huge numbers of systems to host and support that load that's coming through. Okay, so let me back up one here. I just want to reiterate our structure. We have Test Studio, which is kind of the management console. We're going to build tests there. The controller marshals everything out to the individual agents. The agents execute and generate that load, receive back the responses from the application, and then they pass all of that data back to the reporter. And then the reporter is where Test Studio will interface back to let you do your analysis and whatnot. So let's flip back to Test Studio and actually now start to dive into things with a little bit more detail. So if you're already familiar with Test Studio, then you're probably familiar with how we can build up functional tests to execute and run things like I'm an anonymous user and I want to log on to the site and I want to browse for a particular product and add that product to my shopping cart, for example. So this is an example of doing this. And we've added that to our shopping cart, and then we're done. Okay, so that's a functional test there, and we can see that everything's passed. So I can take that same functional test, I can run it as a performance test. This is really off topic for today's webinar, but that's something that we've got a lot of documentation around. Performance testing in Test Studio takes one vertical slice, and we'll break that down into a lot of great detail about that one particular case. So as I build up my functional tests, I can make use of these to start building up my performance test, or pardon me, my load run. So here I've got a load run that I've been working on, and as I start to work with this, I can go to design mode, and here's where I'm going to start to assemble the various odds and ends that deal with this. There's one question about the if we're recording the webinar. Yes, I'm recording the webinar, and as long as things don't crash, I will be producing an offline recording of that and posting that to Telerik TV. So Telerik TV you can get to through tv.telerik.com. So with any load test scenario, you really want to make sure that you're getting an effective mix of different user profiles or different user use cases or scenarios. There are a number of different terminologies, but the idea is that I want to start to piece together a realistic test that's going to have multiple users doing many different things across my system. And an example of that might be, so here's just one thing that doesn't necessarily apply back to this specific demo that I'm working with, but we want a certain number of users doing things like browsing. We want a number of different users doing things like searching, or navigating directly to a product page, or reading blogs and reading news. And it's important to have this mix because this is how your system is going to be behaving on a day-to-day basis. So how do you start to understand what that mix might look like? If you're working with a system that's already in place, then one great source for you to understand how that system's being used are your system logs. So if your system's running on IIS, you can turn on logging and understand how the system is being used in the live world. Apache and every other web server platform has some capability to allow you to turn on logging at the web server level and understand kind of what's going on from that aspect. Your system itself might give you that idea. Maybe you do some internal tracking. This is going to be different for every application and every installation, but the point is, if you have something running already, then have a look at the system logs and see if you can start to understand what that actual real world mix looks like. If you're working with a greenfield project, meaning a brand new web property, an application that hasn't ever been hosted out in the live before, then try to find and do a bit of research to see if there are similar properties and applications around that you might be able to start to understand what the use cases look like with that. And if all else fails, then just go back to your basic business and marketing stakeholders and have a conversation with them about how they see the system being used. Approach this from the whole team aspect. Your testers are going to have different views. Your developers might have some different views. But pay great attention to the business people because they're the ones that should be driving the conversation about what they think your customers are actually going to be using. Okay, so I've kind of beat that to death. The big takeaway here is that you can't make simplistic load testing scenarios. You need to have them realistic, and that's a number of different actions. So how can we start to build up these scenarios? These are not functional tests. These are very different from functional tests. The functional test, as you saw, popped open the browser, drives it around, checks for things on the rendered page, clicks buttons, interacts with elements on the page. But for load tests, instead what we work with are actual profiles which are monitoring individual requests to the server and taking a look at the responses that come back. So these are at the protocol level, not at the user interface level, but rather the more important communication that's actually going across the wire between the client and the server. So we see the exact request headers here. The headers are actually editable. If you needed to change something, you could go in there and edit them. And if I cancel out of here, we can also see that we can also add in think times. So this is a really critical aspect. You want to simulate exactly how your users are going to be hitting the system. A functional test, when I play that back, it goes from step to step to step to step with no pauses. It will execute that as quickly as possible. It will pause at any point where you have, say, created a wait condition for dynamic content to come back, like AJAX responses or whatnot. But what it doesn't do is simulate someone doing something like clicking to a product page and reading and understanding what they're looking for. Oh, these are the notebooks here. I want to browse to the Graviton. The page loads up. I'm going to have some time here where I read through things, and that might be seconds or minutes before I do my next action of, say, adding that particular product to the shopping cart. So when you're doing your load testing, you want to mimic that same notion, and these are called think times. Now, as we capture our scenarios or our user profiles, so in our terminology, a user profile is one of those use cases, a functional action. So a user logging on, hitting the site, navigating, taking steps through. As we capture that, we will capture what we see as the think time duration, and we'll also throw in this deviation because we don't want everybody behaving exactly the same. So we'll throw in a standard deviation here. Now, the default, as we're capturing things, which I'll show in a few moments, is 3 seconds. But the point being here, you can tailor this as you need. So while we're at this, let's talk very quickly about dynamic targets. Dynamic targets are, if you think back, you're going to have a number of different users hitting, let's say, one product page. So how does your server differentiate that I've got this connection on this product page and I have these 5 other connections, but I need to send something back to user A, but I've got B, C, D, E, and F on 5 different connections? So dynamic targets are built in as the developers are creating the system, and this is their way of tracking specific session IDs so that when a request comes into the server, we know that this request is from user A and not user F. So dynamic targets, selecting these, lets us mimic or generate dynamically and keep track of ensuring that each session is properly being handled so that we aren't confusing traffic for user A with user F, B, or D. So how do you decide which of these dynamic targets you actually need to deal with? At this point, this is where it's different for every system. It's different for every page in that system, potentially, and it may be different for different actions within that page, within that system. So there's no way for us to magically say you need these 3 dynamic targets and not these other 8. When you're starting to build up your load test scenarios, we'll identify the dynamic targets for you, but you need to have a conversation with the developers and understand exactly what's needed to ensure that you are using only the dynamic targets that you need. So we can kind of prompt and help a bit, but at the end of the day, what you really need to do is have that conversation with the developers. Yes, you'll need these ones and not the others. So we show you the target, we show you what that content of it looks like, and we can also show from and to as far as the steps that's going from. So I've already got that selected. I'll cancel out of that. And I've given you some good exposure about what a user scenario looks like here. Let's show you how we bring those in. So I'm going to pause for a moment while I get another drink. Okay, so we have a number of different ways that we can start assembling our user profiles for these specific tests. So I can import, and if I import something, I can actually pull in an external file from a different user profile. If I've saved that off, I can add a user profile from elsewhere in there. I can also capture from an existing web test. So I can browse to a web test that I already have created. And let's see, what would be an interesting one to add here? So I'm going to add a test about a user. Actually, no, I'm not going to do that. Let me first get rid of this particular one, and then I'm going to add that back in to show you how this works. So as an anonymous user, I want to add something to the cart. So I'm going to capture this one. and I can capture from any of our 4 supported browsers. So Test Studio, if you're not familiar with the product, we do all of our recording of functional tests in IE, but we'll play back in IE, Firefox, Safari, or Chrome as long as you have those installed on the system where the test is being run. So I'm going to go ahead and capture that from IE, and we'll see that IE will start up and it'll run through that particular use case of going to the site, navigating around, and adding something to the cart. So that's finishing up, and now we've got our user profile for this. And here again we see dynamic targets, and I happen to know that for this particular scenario, this is the only dynamic target I need to select. So I'll select Done there. We did have some think times that were captured. By default, we'll put in 10 seconds and deviation of 3 because we don't really have an idea what those might have been. So you'll see that all of those are 10 and 3. I'll just leave all of those as is. So now I'll save this, and now I'm just going to bump this up to 2%. So if I have another action that I'm thinking about that I may not have a use case for, let's say that I actually want to simulate someone who has Googled and found out something interesting about quantum computers, and maybe they have landed directly on this page here from a Google hit. So some sites may have a high proportion of users that are coming directly to specific pieces of content or products or what have you, and it's handy to be able to capture that. So the idea is not that I'm hitting the home page and navigating to this, but rather that I'm going straight to this page. So I can simulate that just by copying the URL, and I'm going to close down Firefox, and now let me capture another action here. So I'm going to capture a new action, and I'm going to capture this using Firefox. So now we notice Firefox got opened up, and at the moment now we actually have a proxy attached here. So now when I paste in that, we navigate, I'm there at this piece of news, and I can go ahead and close out the browser, and I'll click Done here to let everything know that we're done with this particular action. And so here again, we've captured think times for the particular actions that I've taken. And if I wanted to add think time, I could actually even poke something in here, and let's say add a think time in here. And now I've got a think time where I could do something like say, okay, well, this is the part where somebody's reading, so we'll say that might be a 15-second think time, and we'll just leave the deviation at 3. Dynamic targets, the same thing. Now in this case, because for this particular use case we went directly to that news article page, and that's just serving up content, there's really no interaction back and forth, there's no dynamic targets that were captured. So I don't even have to worry about this time. So we'll click Done here. We'll save this off. We've got a capture here. I'm going to go ahead and rename this. I should have done that at the start. Now I should be more specific about which news article I went to, but we'll just leave that here as is. And we'll bump this up to 7%. Maybe that was a very important news article that got a lot of hits on Google. Now the final thing that I can do is I can pull in a Fiddler trace. Now if you're not familiar with Fiddler, Fiddler is a great little application that acts as a proxy, and it monitors traffic to sites. So if I start up and Oh, I don't want that right now, not during a demo. You notice that it's capturing HTTP requests and transactions that are going back and forth, but it will also capture traffic that's going to my Quantum site. So Fiddler is often used when people are trying to troubleshoot a website because it gives you great exposure into exactly what's going on with the communication. But the handy thing is that I can actually save that file out as a SAS file, S-A-Z, and that's useful for, again, handing off to whoever your tech support is. But in our case, this is very handy because I can import that Fiddler capture file. So right here, let's go out and I can browse, and here is one that I'd done earlier. So I'd actually browsed to a product from the main menu. So I'll pull that in. And we can crack this open and we see exactly the same sorts of things. This was all from the Fiddler capture. Now, one thing that Fiddler doesn't always do well are the think times, so you may need to tweak those, but you get the idea here. All right, and I'm going to bounce this up a bit here. All right, so excuse me. So this is how we go about assembling a number of different scenarios to run through. I can use existing functional tests. I can capture new scenarios that maybe I didn't have a functional test for. I can import things from Fiddler traces. So we've got our bits and pieces together. If I need to, let's talk for a moment about virtual users. So this section here shows us the available virtual users that I have license for. And in this case, I have allocated a certain number of virtual users against the controller that I'm currently working with. All right, took a little bit to connect to the controller here. So this is on my local machine here, and I've got 2,081 virtual users allocated to the controller that's running on the demo machine. So maybe I have a number of different controllers that I'm using for different load test scenarios. In this case, I've just got about 2,000 that I've allocated to this, and I can start spreading them out across all of these different user profiles or these different use cases. So I could evenly balance the workload, but what I'm trying to do here is make a mix and match of kind of a different set of scenarios. So I can directly buy more users here if I need to. That would get me out to Telerik.com where I could make another purchase if I needed to plus this up. But I think we're good to go here. So let's take a quick look first off at the environment that we've got. So in this case, I've got this computer set up, which is running my controller and my reporter. And on this particular system, I have one agent. If I had more agents installed here, they'd show up here. I do need to caveat this that I'm running this demo now in a Server 2008 R2 standard operating system, but it's within a virtual machine. So I'm running the system that we're testing, I'm running Test Studio, I'm running all of the miscellaneous bits and pieces here. This is totally not a realistic architecture or layout for a serious load test. What I'm trying to do is illustrate all of the various moving parts and pieces and how you can access them. So I only have one agent, and that's actually installed on this system as well. So you can see here that our load test is able to talk to each of the different controllers, reporters, and agents that we have set up. And each of those run as an individual service on this system. So we can see that here's the host. If I had more configured, they'd show up here as well. But this is the central management for the various services that you have set up for your load testing. And you'll notice that they each run on different ports on the machines. I can also control my database configuration here as needed. So I'll cancel out of that. All right, so let's go ahead and we'll double check back with design, and we're going to take a quick look at how we set things up. So I'm going to start with one user. I'm going to ramp up to a total of 500 users, and I'm going to run the test for 3 minutes, and I'm going to have a ramp up time of 1 minute. So this gives us an idea that after 1 minute we'll be up to our max concurrent users, and we're going to run for 3 minutes. I could alter these as needed. Now, the value for start and end users is too low. This is merely stating that my mix that I have here is actually less than 100%, and then also that we are not using all of the available users that are allocated to this controller. All of that is absolutely okay. So I'm going to run over here, and I'm going to try to run this test. However, it looks like I have an issue from that last test not having successfully stopped. Alright, so I've got to do a quick little dance here. I want to save all of that. I'm going to pop back open that services. And I think this is due to me having been monkeying around with things right before I started the demo, which is always a bad idea. So I'm just recycling these services. This is not something you would normally need to do. This is due to me having kludged things up here. Alright, so we've got our services back and running. Let's restart Test Studio. And then we'll see if this is going to cooperate a little better. Oh, while this is getting started up, one thing that I do want to mention is before you get moving with your load test runs, you'll want to do a number of steps which you can automate, which are kind of setup steps. You want to make sure that your environment is properly configured. Maybe you want to restart IIS. You'll likely want to ensure that all of your pages are warmed up. I have a little Ruby script that I run in the background that hits my entire site and can run through and make sure that everything's warmed up and active. So this will actually fire up Internet Explorer using water at the command line, and it just goes and it hits all of the various pages. So these sorts of things are really critical because you'll want to ensure that your system is in a stable, known, and ready state before you start doing a serious load test. In addition, I can hit Performance Monitor and start to gather metrics on any number of Performance Monitor counters that I've had set up beforehand. Alright, so that all looks to be working well. We're going to bounce that off, and then let's get back to Test Studio. I'm going to go back to our load. So it will load this up. Notice that it's taking a moment to connect to all the reporters and agents. Things have turned green there. So we'll double check everything here. 1 and 3. I think we are able to all right. Here we go. And off we go. So sending the test to the controller, we've got our different user profiles that are set up. We've got the overall count, and now this is going to fire off and start running here, and we can take a look at the various metrics that we've got available. So we'll take a look at the current number of virtual users, our response time, which is a pretty interesting one that we want to make sure that we are dealing with properly. And we can also take a look at time to first byte. Actually, let's swap out current virtual users for, how about total created? So this will now give us a nice indication of how things are going here. Now, keep in mind again that all of these moving parts are running on one virtual machine, which is completely not the way that you want your actual environment set up. So don't pay attention to the specific metrics. Rather, the important thing here is that we're gathering pieces of information as we're executing through. And throughout this time, I can move around and analyze different pieces of information here. I can take a look at, for example, the total kilobytes that are sent or received. So I simply toggle things off here, and we'll notice that the scale changes as these are going. So we're seeing that we still don't have any faulted users. That's good. And we can see that we're not picking up any HTTP errors yet, which is also good, but we can see that the response time is continuing to degrade a bit. So at this point now, we can start to make some analysis on how the system is behaving so that we can determine, for example, look here at this point, we've got a serious start to spike up, and this is at about 650 total users. And we can see that we should be maxed out at 500. However, the scale is so small at this point that we don't get a great visual there. But the point being that when I hover over things, I can get exact data points at those particular spots. All right. And I can flip over and we can see how Performance Monitor is kicking through there as well. And not surprisingly, we can see that we're getting page faults and processor spikes as well. Okay. So this demo was meant to show how we can gather in a number of different articles that are coming through, how we can gather up a number of different user profiles or use cases. We can capture those, we can import them, we can use a current web test, we can run manual tests and gather the data in from that. Once we've got that, we can kick things off, controlling a good ramp-up time, duration, total number of users. We manage our virtual users through this interface here, and once we've got the test going, then we've got easy analysis through our nice interface right here to be able to understand how the system's behaving and start to understand at what points we're going to be tipping over. So we've hit the demo. With Test Studio, we've got a we allow you to choose exactly the number of virtual users that you need. So you can buy virtual user packs in any size that really fits your need, anywhere from 100 up to 10,000. If you need more than 10,000 virtual users, if you're working with some huge site, then you can buy multiple packs of that. So thank you everyone for attending. My contact information is up there. I do want to point out that Test Studio comes with 20 virtual users that you can use for local experimentation on your local system. They're not allowed for production use, but you can start to experiment with load testing, understand how things are set up, get a feel for it, and determine if this meets your needs. And then at that point, you can work to get the particular license pack that fits your particular scenarios. So I'm really excited about this release. Load testing is a great release for us. It builds upon what we had put in place with our performance testing release last year. We follow the same type of easy-to-use conventions. We don't force you to get into code where you don't need to. We've got a very clean interface, and you can use you can use any of your existing tests that you have already in place and bring those over to build up really powerful load scenarios. And at the end of the day, this helps you answer those stakeholder questions about, will the site survive this new product launch? How is our users' experiences during times of significant load? So that's the end of my demo and my presentation. If anyone's got any questions, be happy to answer them. We'll keep the line open for another few minutes in order to answer some questions. I'm going to go on mute so that I can get another drink and try to wet my throat a little bit. Regardless, thank you very much for attending, and we hope that you'll give load testing a try.